I've just recently started doing a little bit of Twitch, and you never know when you're actually live. And so you can either get cut off or look like a rambling idiot, and it's usually the latter one. So there we are. Good. So yeah, thanks very much for coming to .NET Knots. Is this the second month we've had the new logo and font and stuff like that?
Yeah.
But thanks to Jess for doing that. That's all Jess's work, and it's fantastic. I do like that. As I mentioned earlier, we have a code of conduct. It basically summarizes as be nice to everybody. And if you feel in any way uncomfortable or something happens that you're not happy with, then get in contact with either myself or Jess, either through the chat or on Slack or on Twitter, any way that you feel is comfortable doing, and we will look into that. And if there's anything that we need to look at, we will keep you informed of that process directly. And yeah, so there's no reason for anybody to feel uncomfortable during one of our meetings. In fact, we pride ourselves on being as inclusive as possible. So please do be nice to each other. Normally at this point, again, we'd be talking about how we like BGSS and Cordius because they would be our sponsors normally, but being as they're not providing us with pizza and beer or a location, then the only thing we have is a Zoom license, and that's why my company, PJG Creations, is mentioned on there, because that's the only costs we have. But stickers, they are still providing us with stickers. I do need to get in contact with them, actually, because I haven't got any more .NET Not stickers left. But having said that, that design's old anyway, so we need some new stickers for that. JetBrains are still sponsoring us. There's a good chance to win a JetBrains license tonight. If you don't know what JetBrains do, they make developer tools for developers. So things like ReSharper, WebStorm, PHP Storm, IntelliJ, all of those fancy things is what they do. So do tweet on the hashtag .NETKnots, and we will try and remember at the end, if we can, to pull out a winner for that, and then we'll get in contact, send you a code for a single 12-month subscription to one of their products. So tonight we've got Stephen Haunts. I know I always get a bit scared when I get to these places, just making sure I've spelt everything right. But he's going to be talking about cross-platform game development with MonoGame and .NET. So that's going to be fantastic. Coming up, we have got next month, we've got the fabulous Martin Beebe and Luce Carter coming along. So that'll be a good double act. And so Martin's going to be talking about real-time serverless apps with Blazor and AWS. So Blazor is a hot topic at the moment. And Luce is going to be talking Zero to Mobile Hero, Xamarin, and Azure Cognitive Services. So that should be good too. Next month at Knots IoT, we've got Davide Zordan talking about Unity for .NET developers, and Paul DiCarlo is going to be talking about edge processing and cloud stuff. He's one of the senior cloud developers over at Microsoft for the Azure IoT stack. So that should be a good meetup too. Tomorrow, I believe this is, DevOps Knots have got Mark Jones and Martin Copeland speaking about choreographed microservices and DevSecOps, which is a trigger word for a lot of people. So it'll be interesting to hear what he's got to say. As always, we like to mention Tech Nottingham. It's a fabulous community for Nottingham, for the Nottingham tech community, as it makes obvious on the screen. Do go ahead and join their Slack channel. It's really good. They've got a channel for everything on their Slack channel, so go ahead and join that. And this coming month, in a couple of days' time, is Hacktoberfest. And at this point, I will switch across to Jess and let her give you a little bit of information about Hacktoberfest.
And let's try and do this as smoothly as possible.
No HTML or anything. So.
It makes life a lot easier, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, Hacktoberfest kicks off for October. And for those who don't know, this is an initiative run by DigitalOcean to encourage contributions to open source. It's open to anyone, all levels. And if you submit four or five pull requests, can't remember which one, throughout October, then you can choose between getting stickers and a t-shirt or having a tree planted, which is a nice little addition this year. We have a number of issues going on. So first of all, if you go to our .NET Knots blog, there is a post on how you can contribute during Hacktober. It will take you through every single step. So if you are new, it will walk you through exactly what to do. And it walks you through some of our repositories as well. So we have two repositories. One is the blog, where you can submit blog posts. We will welcome anything that is .NET related. So please let me know if you have an idea, raise an issue, put forward a PR for a blog post, get in touch with me and Pete if you need any help. The other thing that we've got, which is what I mainly want to talk about today, is the .NET Knots web repo. So we are rebuilding our website with your help. This is all in Blazor. Thank you to Pete for setting up the initial bits and bobs for it. There are a number of issues, all at different levels, that you can come and pick up, or you can add issues yourself. And this will head over to this lovely blank site currently. So please do help us build the site that you would like for this meetup. We would like any input whatsoever. Our code of conduct does apply to all of our repositories as well. But if you have any questions, please do get in touch on Twitter, in the chat, or otherwise happy to talk through it all. And next we have Stephen with his talk. There will be lots of ducks within this talk. None of them were harmed during the making of it, I am assured.
Yes, they were.
Can't guarantee that.
But only virtually.
No animals were harmed during the process of making Stephen's talk. Stephen is a fantastic developer, speaker. He does talks for Pluralsight. You can see him at multiple conferences and is an all-around good guy. So please give him a warm .NET Knots welcome.
Thank you very much, Jess.
So I shall go ahead and share my screen. I'll presume that if something goes horribly wrong, Pete will just jump in and shout. PowerPoint. Oh, we're doing. That's a good start, isn't it? Now I've lost my mouse.
While you're setting up, if there's any questions during Pete's talk, please feel free to put them into the chat, or we can take them afterwards as well.
Or Stephen's talk.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Stephen.
Either of us.
We're looking at it.
Have you broken it now?
Stephen appears frozen to me. I don't know.
He's very still, isn't he? I wonder if it's sharing his PowerPoint has crashed Zoom like it did to me. It does as well, yeah. So I think there's a bug in Zoom at the moment that crashes Zoom when you try and share PowerPoint.
We've lost him temporarily, but hopefully he'll come back in a second.
Yeah. Temporarily.
Il y a des gens qui peuvent te voir. Tu vois?
Yeah. Oh, here we are. I'll let Stephen back in again.
I'll see you later, okay? Off you go.
All right. Where is he?
He's down the bottom for me now. Hello, Stephen.
I need to make a host again now.
So BT OpenReach decided to not do its thing.
Oh, is that what it was?
And
Zoom
my
crashes for me all the time now.
Okay, so let me just double check where I am. Okay.
It's that bad, is it?
Right. Should we try this again? Okay, I can still see people moving, so that's good. Can you see my slides?
I can see them perfectly.
Right. Okay. Let's hope BT isn't having an issue tonight. So this talk is writing cross-platform games with MonoGame and .NET. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's a brand new talk. I've literally just written it, literally. Normally, when I write a new talk, I guinea pig it with my user group, Derby Developers, but we've got the user group on hiatus at the moment. Sort of decision that we all made as leaders of the group, just because lockdown was stressful, so we didn't want to have to run a user group. So that means you're all my guinea group. So congratulations. So I mostly write courses for Pluralsight and also write a load of courses for Skillshare. Been doing this for quite a few years now. So I've got 22 courses on Pluralsight and 14 on Skillshare. And got a new course coming out soon, which is great. I won't bore you with that. So I want to start by looking back, because I'm in my 40s, and when you're in your 40s, you tend to look back at things you did when you was a kid. And the games industry was actually a big part of what I did in my earlier years. So a lot of people tend to know me these days because of, working at banks and doing Pluralsight and speaking and all of that. But that really was not where I saw my trajectory when I was younger. So I started out in games when I was 15 or 16 with a good friend of mine, Chris, and somehow by writing a game on the Amiga 1200, we managed to get a publishing contract with a small publisher called GKS Design. And I've got a small interview you can see on the screen now from Amiga Power back in 1994, I think it was. So quite a few years ago. And, being young, naive, and probably a bit cocky for a 16-year-old, we thought our trajectory was set. This is it. We're going to write this game, publish it, retire, as you do when you're that young. But sadly, that didn't happen. But the game itself, the one that we worked on here, was called Dark Mission. It was a cross between Syndicate from Bullfrog, if anyone remembers that game. And it was also a bit of a kind of graphic adventure game as well. So lots of combat, but lots of adventuring elements as well. Heavily influenced by Aliens. In fact, we completely ripped off Aliens because we were massive fans of the film. So we borrowed heavily from that. And you can see the main character down the bottom there, sort of a manga anime style, but also looks like Rodney from Only Fools and Horses. But, this is something that we worked on. But sadly, at the time we was working on this, Commodore decided in their infinite wisdom that they were going to go bust, which caused us a bit of a problem because I didn't actually know how to code for any other platforms at the time. I was Amiga only. So when you're a one platform kind of person and the person who owns the platform goes out of business, that kind of triggers certain exit clauses in contracts, which is a bit annoying. So I went to university. At the time, I saw that as, the fallback strategy going to uni. It was about when I just finished college, when all this started happening. But then when I was at uni, I got an opportunity to go work for a company called Argonaut Software in London. So some people might have heard of these from Star Fox and the Super FX chip in the Super Nintendo. But they did other games like Croc, Legend of the Gobos, Alien Resurrection, Red Dog, and lots of other games like that. So I spent quite a few years working with them. And when I got to the end of my placement year, they actually turned around to me and said, "We like you. Do you want to jack this university thing in and come work for us?" Yeah, of course. Who wouldn't? Getting into a company like that was really, really hard. So at the time I thought, okay, well, university's got me the job. That's kind of what university does. It gets you in the industry, doesn't it? And it done that. So I didn't really see the need to complete year 4, which probably was a bit silly looking back, but that's what I did. From there, I went on to core design in Derby. So that's when I finally moved up to the Midlands, back in year 2000, actually, 20 years ago, Jesus. And when I was working there, I was working on a launch title game for the Xbox, the original Xbox. It was a game called Race Nation, which sadly never came out. But my job was to write race AI for the opponent cars. So it was lots of like calculating race lines and sort of trying to accelerate a car around a track, which was quite cool. So I did projects for them, stuff for Eidos, and then I moved to a company called Criterion Studios. Most of you have probably heard of Criterion from the game Burnout, which is one of their sort of popular franchises. But Criterion had kind of 2 parts in them. They had the game studio, which done games like Burnout, Black, and other things like that. But they also had a technical side, a research side, which produced a renderware. Well, they produced a middleware system called Renderware, which was a cross-platform rendering library, which allowed you to, write the code, not quite once, but, write one block of code and it would run on PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube at the time, although at that time we wasn't allowed to call it GameCube, it was called Dolphin. So it's basically a cross-platform rendering system. EA, I'll talk a bit more about some of the things I was doing there in a minute, but EA bought out Criterion Studios, which is kind of weird. So overnight, I've suddenly gone from working from this small developer to working for Electronic Arts, which was not a particularly pleasant company to work for. So I left, and I finished up my stint or my tour of duty in the games industry working for a company called Full Fat Productions, who were in Coventry at the time. So they used to mostly do handheld games. They're probably more famous now for doing mobile games like Flick Golf and stuff like that. Cracking company, but it was in Coventry. So commuting from Derby to Coventry every day starts to take its toll on you. So a few of the things I worked on, just because they were fun. So on top left there, you've got Croc, Legend of the Gobos. It's kind of a Super Mario clone on Game Boy Color. My job on that was level design and writing the actual editor, which takes in all the game assets, all of the tiles, lets the designers build out the levels and put, like gems and boxes and stuff all over it. And then what I had in there was a feature where it basically compiled all of the game assets down into ZAT assembler. So the 32 by 32 blocks would get chopped down into 8 by 8 blocks, everything deduplicated, palettes all sorted out, and then rendered into assembler, which was quite fun. That's kind of my first game that I ever worked on that got published. The next one along is Alien Resurrection, which is probably the most doomed game I've ever worked on in my life. It was supposed to be out for the film, Alien Resurrection. It was about a year late. It was an absolute disaster. I didn't work on the actual game, but I was drafted in on the last 2 months of Panic to help fix bugs. That was fun. Don't think I was ever credited on that, thankfully, because the game was absolutely terrible. Also did a few other things. So the Nintendo 3DS port of Sid Meier's Pirates, the PSP version of Sid Meier's Pirates. Game on the bottom left there, which never came out, was called Black and White Creatures on the Nintendo DS. Real shame it didn't come out. So Black and White, if you're familiar with it, is the Lionhead Studios IP. We were 2 months away from completion. The last job we had to do was European and Japanese localization, but the company that had the license from Lionhead at the time went bust, and so did the contract to publish the game. And sadly, we couldn't rekindle the contract, so sitting on someone's hard drive somewhere is the complete version of that game, which never got released. Just a crying shame. And then just the last game that I ever worked on was called Sims Pets on the Nintendo DS. This was an interesting game. We did this at Full Fat Productions. EA got in touch and said, basically, we want you to rip off Nintendogs, pretty much their exact words, in the game world of The Sims, and you've got 9 months to do it, to get it on the shelves. Now, bearing in mind, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to manufacture the cartridges and actually distribute them to the warehouses. That was quite a short time span to get the game done, but we did it. It wasn't particularly engaging or deep game, just because of the time we had, but there's just a few of the things that I worked on. And then kind of at that point, I just got married, we bought a house, we're talking about a family and all that. And commuting to Coventry was getting a bit of a drag and expensive. Derby wasn't quite the hotbed of games development that it used to be. So Core kind of disappeared and they sort of, that all went a bit wrong for them. Eurocom were on the skids and, it was just getting increasingly harder to get decent games industry jobs at the time. And still live where we wanted to live. So at that point, I moved on to banking. Before I move on to that, though, I just want to talk about this system here, just because it's cool and I have fond memories of it. When we was at Criterion Software, we worked on this cross-platform rendering system called Renderware. We actually built a game development system called Renderware Studio, which is what you can see on the screen. It kind of looks a bit old and wonky because it was lots of COM controls held together with VB script. But if you think about what Unity is now and what Unity lets you do, this was about 5 years before Unity was ever really kind of popular. And what this system let you do is you had a very thin game engine that would run on a console. So you can see on the screen there, you've got GameCube, PC, PS2 and Xbox at the time, the original Xbox. And each of those consoles would run this sort of small game engine that the developers would build upon. And then you set up a network connection, so you did right-click connect. And then as you dragged assets into the game, they suddenly appeared on the consoles and you could walk around them, interact with them. You wrote what were called behaviors in C++. And in the C++ header files, you would add a little macro scripting language, which you could use to define user interface controls for the editor. So this whole system let you, drag assets in, animation, inverse kinematics, skins, all that sort of stuff, put behaviors on them, link everything together with events. And that's kind of how a lot of games were built. So I think GTA 4 used this, as well as a lot of the Harry Potter games at the time were built using this system, which is absolutely fantastic until EA liked it, bought the company, but didn't actually use the technology and it kind of got killed, which was a bit sad, but that's just one of these things that happens in the games industry. Anyway, about 2005, I got to the realization that I actually need to get a proper job. So at that point, I left the games industry and started working at Egg in Derby. I was there for 5 years. And then that kind of took me on to the trajectory that I'm on now. So I had to go from a senior developer job at a games company, basically back down to a junior developer, because I'd never worked in a bank or anything like that before. So I kind of had to go backwards to go forwards, if that makes sense. Just notice my notes hasn't appeared on my iPad, which is interesting. Okay, so fast forward on to 2020. What a fun year. And there is a point to this. I'm getting to it. So, like everyone else, we're all stuck in lockdown at home. I've got 2 kids, had to try and homeschool them. One of them has just recently been diagnosed with ADHD and autism, which when you've just found this out and you're actually trying to figure out how to educate them, because we're not specialist teachers, let alone special needs teachers, it was kind of really, really stressful. So, and I've sort of suffered with depression before in the past. This isn't a soft skills talk, so don't worry. But one of my ways of dealing with depression that works for me is that I have to build something. I have to create something. So I have to have this thing in the distance that I'm working on that's creative, that I can focus on. So when things are a bit crap, I can just focus on this one thing. That's kind of how I deal with stuff, and that's kind of how I've always dealt with stuff. And that's exactly why I'm here now doing this talk, because I sort of thought, let's just try and build something that's completely different to what I normally do in my current job, because that kind of keeps me sane. Yeah, so that was kind of the light bulb moment. I'm just going to try and figure out why. Just bear with me a second, because my slides are not showing up. I can't see the presenter view. Okay. Swap displays. Is that going to work? No. Great. Okay. Bear with me one sec, because this will be a lot easier if I can see what I'm doing. Okay, right, that's not going to work. Fine. Technology, who would have it? Oh my God, where's the screen gone? Why is that not coming up? Oh, come on, what screen are you on? I do apologise, I've kind of jinxed myself. Why isn't that showing up?
I'd like to say it's because you're using a Mac, but this is ubiquitous, this problem. Nothing to do with Macs whatsoever.
What, things disappearing? Yeah, hold on.
yeah.
Let me try this again.
It's not even a COVID problem. We all did this on stage once or twice.
Oh, lots of times. What? Where on earth? Oh.
There should be a button you could press that just puts cat gifs on the screen for everybody else while this is going on. Or dog gifs, I'm not catist.
I've completely lost my slides. What is going on?
I think one of the favorite ones I've seen was a speaker who I hugely respect locked themselves out their laptop. They forgot their own password because they were on stage in front of a whole load of people. And I felt so sorry for them.
Yeah, that's embarrassing. That's what you've got it.
Right, here somewhere. Why isn't it coming
all
up?
desktops, isn't it? You just selected all desktops there a second ago, so it should be on everything. How odd.
Yeah. Oh, right. Close down Visual Studio. You are literally the only thing running. Where are you?
Oh God, I've just Googled it, and it can open off screen sometimes. Dear.
Right. Force quit. PowerPoint. Bang. Right.
It's nice to see you still get Microsoft error reporting popping up on a Mac as well.
Oh, yeah. Right, okay. So I'm not going to have any kind of notes. I'm going to have to completely wing it.
Nice.
That's fine. Right, so you can all see what I'm doing. Okay, yeah, so I had this idea that I want to work on something that's kind of different to what I normally do with Pluralsight and books and all that sort of stuff. Just something that I can kind of focus on just to keep me sane whilst trying to figure out how to teach my son and an 11-year-old daughter who has the northeast temperament of my wife. So trying to teach her is interesting. Right. yeah, so this is my way of focusing on depression. So focusing on a problem that you can solve over time, something not work related. And I don't think anyone's ever read this, but there's a guy called Napoleon Hill who wrote a book called Think and Grow Rich. It's kind of a personal finance book, but some of the things he's talking about is actually visualizing success. And kind of one of the premises of the book is that they're saying that the reason a lot of millionaires have become millionaires is because one of the first steps they do is they visualize themselves in that step first and then work out the steps to get there. It's kind of a small but powerful technique, but it kind of works with anything. You kind of visualize what success looks like, what you expect the end result to be. Then you start working backwards about how you think you're going to get there, which is exactly what I did with this. So the next stage was study the shit out of it. So me being me, I go out and buy lots of books on stuff, try and find courses on it, blogs, just digest as much information as I can and take small steps every day. So some days I might get to spend an hour or two on some of this stuff. Some days it might be 10, 15 minutes. But if you do a little bit each day, you kind of gradually, build a lot. So no more soft skills stuff. This is all like nerd stuff now. So when it comes to building a game that's cross-platform, no, I've lost my mouse cursor. Can you see that error reporting thing that just popped up? Right, it's gone. Okay. So when you're building a game, you have kind of two options, really. You can use an engine or you can use a framework. So an engine is something that's kind of more complete. All the real hard stuff's been done for you. So you're just basically building the game with assets and scripts and stuff. So examples of this are Unreal Engine, Unity, Godot or Godot, whatever it's called. There's kind of people still argue about how you're supposed to pronounce it, but it's a very good free open source system you can use. And the one on the bottom right is one that not many people have heard of, but it's fantastic. It's called Defold. So everyone heard of King, the company that makes like all these like gem games like Candy Crush and all of that. So Defold is their internal engine that they build all their games and become mega bazillionaires with. So they open sourced it and they have a full-time team of maintainers working on it for them. And it's a fantastic way. If you want to build 2D cross-platform mobile games quickly and release them, then that's an absolutely fantastic system to use. But me being me, I'm a C# developer. I love C#. I wanted to actually write code. Then I can show it to Microsoft and hopefully keep my MVP award. So that's kind of how that works. So I thought, let's look at MonoGame. Now, MonoGame has got a really interesting history. So it started out as something called XNA. So I don't know if people remember back quite a few years, the XNA framework. And this was, to me, this really was Microsoft at their best. This was absolutely fantastic. So they released the Xbox 360, which is still a fantastic machine. But people were like clamoring to be able to do homebrew dev on these machines. And what tends to happen is you get a load of sort of hackers and clever people finding out ways of basically circumventing security on the machines and using that as a way to do homebrew dev. So Microsoft are just like, well, let's just build a system to let them do it anyway. So they come up with XNA, which is a games library that you can use with C#, and that kind of gave birth to the whole Xbox Live Arcade experience of sort of lots of little small, interesting games that are developed by people like us, people who want to build something who aren't mega corporations. Now, before I go on to that, so XNA, sadly, Microsoft has a habit of doing this. When they build something really good, they have a habit of killing it over time. So that's exactly what they did with XNA. But people were really keen on using it. So open source group basically started up and they thought, well, let's build our own version that uses exactly the same interfaces. So it's pretty much a carbon copy. Of course, they didn't have the original code because Microsoft wasn't as free and open as they were back then. So they decided to build their own version, which is MonoGame. And MonoGame has been around for a very long time. I remember looking at it when it first came out thinking, oh yeah, that's cute. Didn't really think it'd ever go anywhere. But when I started to look at doing this project during lockdown, I kind of looked back at it and thought, oh my God, this is actually a really big thing at the moment. And probably one of the most popular games which people may have heard of is Stardew Valley. Now, Stardew Valley was written in MonoGame. The developer built it in C#, MonoGame, built all the art assets himself. And now this game is available on, PC, Mac. Is it available on the Switch now? I think it's available on the Switch and probably lots of other platforms as well. But it's all MonoGame and C#, which is fantastic. So the website, monogame.net, is kind of where you go to get started. So if we look at some of the stuff on the screen here, so, it leverages C# and other .NET languages on the Microsoft and Mono platforms. Cross-platforms, it currently supports iOS, Android, Mac OS, Linux, Windows, PS4, PS Vita, and Xbox One and Switch. So if that gives you quite a lot of choice. It's all open source, so if you want to dive into the code, you can do. And it's got a pretty vibrant community around it, which is good. Now, MonoGame does let you do 3D, but it's not the same as another games engine. It literally gives you a way of drawing triangles and assigning textures, and then you're pretty much on your own from that point on. So to keep my sanity, I was like, actual photograph of me during lockdown. I was like, let's stick to 2D for my sanity, because I love retro games. I do still like 2D games, so we'll keep it to 2D just to make things easier. Now, a framework like MonoGame gives you basically a few basic features. It doesn't do a lot, but what it does well. So it gives you screen rasterization. So if you have a bitmap of a sprite or a background, you tell it to render it, it will render it. It has a basic asset pipeline. So it has a way of converting assets from paint packages and sound and music and putting it into a format that's compatible with MonoGame. So there's a little tool they provide for doing that. It lets you access input handlers, so keyboard, controller, and mouse. It can play sound effects and music, and it has a basic maths library. So it's quite basic what it does, but it's everything you need. And then on top of that, you want to build your engine. So these are kind of the things that I had to focus on. So we've got a scene graph, which I'll talk about more later, collision detection, sprites and animation, font rendering, internal messaging system, UI controls, and game and scene state management. So they're kind of the bits on top that you need to build, and the exciting bits, I think. So once you've installed MonoGame, so I demo on a Mac, although clearly tonight that seems to be a bad idea. But obviously it works on Windows and Visual Studio as well. Now, when you do File New Create Solution, it gives you an option here, so you can create a cross-platform desktop app. So what that means is it creates something that will work on Mac and Windows, and it uses OpenGL as its renderer. If you're Windows only, then you can do the bottom one, and that does DirectX. Or you can do Android and iPad and iPhone. So I created an engine called, well, you have to give everything a fancy name, didn't you, for GitHub? So I called it Exogame 2D. There is a GitHub address where you can play with it. So I'll quickly show you that now. Though maybe quitting my slides is going to be a bit scary. Where's my mouse gone? Okay, so I now no longer have a mouse cursor. Brilliant. Okay. Oh, do you know what? Let's stay in slides. It's safer. My computer is definitely fighting against me tonight. Where's the swap?
Your mouse cursor came back though.
Yeah. And then I don't know why.
Some positives.
To finish with slides, we'll go back and look at the GitHub repo. So I built a few small little projects over lockdown. One of them was kind of a little riff on Nintendo's Duck Hunt. So if anyone ever had the original NES console where you had the little gun, it was a Duck Hunt game. So that's what you can see up there. I'll hopefully be able to show you that. And I did another one, which was a little version of Conway's Game of Life. Did that as kind of a little homage to Conway, who sadly succumbed to COVID earlier in the year. So quite sad when I found that out. So I spent a weekend just making a little Conway's Game of Life tribute to him, which was really good fun. It's a really fantastic system. Okay, so let's look at Hello World. Let's see if my computer's actually going to let me switch to anything other than slides. So it all started with Hello World. Oh, we have a mouse cursor. Good. And I need to reload my project. So if you download Exogame from the repository, this is kind of what it looks like at the moment. Usual caveats apply. This is kind of work in progress. There are some stinkers in there which I still need to fix. I was hoping to fix them before tonight, but never got around to it. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but there are a few coding horrors in there which I'm not proud of. But it's a personal project. It doesn't really matter. It's not a commercial venture. So I've got it split into 3 sections. So we've got the engine, which is kind of the stuff I've written on top of the framework. some game examples, so Duck Attack and Game of Life. I shall attempt to run them in a moment. Not sure what Zoom's going to say about that. And then I've started writing a series of tutorials just in case anyone actually does want to play around with it. So let's try this out. So we've got a tutorial here. This is my Hello World. So the main entry point is main. I have a class here called Game Loop, which inherits from a class called Game, which is an XNA or MonoGame class. And all you do is you call game.run. And what happens is inside that class, so I have a constructor where I initialize the engine. So I'm setting my render target to be 1080p. Allow user window resizing true. And then what we have is two methods. We have update and draw. Now basically what MonoGame does is it calls update, then draw really, really, really fast. It sits in a very tight loop and it just executes those two methods as fast as it can. Every time it runs it, you get a game time variable here, which tells you the time since the last frame that was called. So if you do actually want to do something that's more frame rate dependent and lock it to a certain frame rate, you have the ability to do that as well. So in this simple Hello World example, I've got update. So we update our input handler. I check whether the escape key is pressed. If it is, I exit. If the F key is pressed, it goes to full screen, or I'm definitely not doing that with Zoom running. And then in the draw loop, you call graphicsDevice.clear. I set it to cornflower blue, call the base class draw, and then it should just paint a blue screen. So let's just hope that works. Run project. Okay, hopefully you can all see a cornflower blue screen. That's Hello World in MonoGame. Brilliant, so that works. So we'll come back to a lot more of the things in here. I might just quickly try and show you some of the game demos, just to show you what it is we've been building. So I'll try Duck Attack first. There is some music in this, hopefully you can hear it. Can you hear the music? Bit of angry banjo music. Okay. So one of the things I built was a Windows UI system, very similar to WinForms in how it works. So I've got some basic controls. So level 1. Starts off nice and slow, but as the levels progress, it gets faster. Should have called it Grouse Hunt. It would have been more topical. I'm now out of ammo, so the birds will just fly away. Yes, it's a very, very, very basic game, but the reason I chose this game is because there's lots of interesting components that make a good first game with an engine. So you've got animated sprites, you've got movements, you've got all the mouse interaction stuff, and then I've got a messaging system that sends messages in between different aspects of the game, which I'll talk about later. So it's actually, whilst it's a simple game, it actually uses quite a lot of interesting parts of the engine to actually make quite a good first game. So let's exit that. The next one is the Game of Life demo. I tweaked it slightly from Conway's rules, so I've now got life expectancy on the cells. So the longer the cells are, they gradually fade out and die, just because it makes it look nice. So if I just try and draw something with the mouse, I don't know, I'm not a very good artist. So if I draw a little picture, some vampire teeth, okay. Sort of straight line at the bottom. Okay, so if I try and then run the simulation, you'll see the sort of the Conway's rules take over and it just kind of all morphs. Don't know how smooth that's coming across for you, but you can see some of the cells fade out. But then if I sort of drag with the mouse, it kind of looks like you're streaming through water a bit, which I thought was quite nice. Can try and build. I think there's a thing here called a glider, which you can build. Oh, you've got a glider here. Anyway, that was kind of the Game of Life demo. So there's two little projects that I've written with it. I've got some ideas for other projects, which I'll tell you about at the end. Right. Okay, so that was Hello World. We sort of looked at the engine. So one of the things that MonoGame provides is an asset pipeline. So if you're dealing with sprites, so bitmaps, PNGs, JPEGs, that sort of thing, They need to be translated into something that the engine's going to understand. Same with sounds, sound effects, and all of that. Yeah, so a good framework will have an asset pipeline to import assets. So it's the same with things like Unity. I mean, they have a way of importing assets. So MonoGame has this little tool. It's not a particularly elegant tool, but it works. So you create a content file, you load all of your assets in. So here you can see I've got some of the assets for Duck Attack. So we've got the background, we've got the banjo music, a bullet graphic, a bullet spent graphic. I did have a temporary image of Daffy Duck in there before I sort of drew some proper sprites, but Daffy Duck's not really in there anymore. But then what you do is you put those assets in, you hit build, it creates a series of game files, and then in your engine, when you want to load up an asset, you just literally call it by its lowercase name here. So you just say load background, and then that loads that asset up. So the way a framework like this works is it's basically a very tight game loop, as just demonstrated. There's two methods that get called over and over again very, very quickly. So ideally, you want to maintain those methods being called at least 60 times a second to get a 60 FPS frame rate. It calls two methods because it separates the updates of game logic from rendering. So in the update method, you'll do things like update the positions of objects on the screen. You might do some AI stuff, checking whether someone's pressed a certain button or hit a certain object with the mouse. That all happens in updates. The draw method, that's purely about drawing stuff on the screen and managing your scene graph. And I'll go through what those look like in a minute. Yeah, so it just runs very, very, very fast. You've got your game logic, AI, physics, if you've got any physics in there, and then you draw your scene graph. Now, one thing you will notice in here is there's no async and await, and that's kind of very deliberate. So when you're working on an enterprise system, when you do async and await, you want the system to go off and do things efficiently in the background and then return when it's all done and it's all nicely parallel. Brilliant for an enterprise system. It's a fantastic feature. Do not want the system controlling that for me when I'm doing a game. I want you to run update and draw as fast as you can. That's all I want it to do. So everything is synchronous. Because at that point, you want to know exactly when everything's running, which is cool. So probably the trickiest thing I had to do is something called view projection scaling. So when you go full screen, it makes a request to the graphic driver, and the graphics driver will return back the most optimal resolution that it thinks it wants to render at. Now, I don't dare go full screen with zoom running because I have no idea what will happen, whether it will return. But if I hit F on most of my demos, it goes into full screen mode. Now, native resolutions can be different on each screen. So I'm working on an iMac here at the minute. So it's a 5K resolution. So it's 5,000 and something along by something equally large in the vertical. But you might be running on a system that, one of these like monitors like Pete's got, where it's about 300 miles long. Or you might have an older monitor and graphics card that can only do 1080p. So when it goes full screen, you have no idea what resolution it's going to render at. So what you need to do is decouple the game world coordinates from the physical screen coordinates. And this is called view projection scaling. So if you look here, so you've got an iMac, you've got the resolution of 5120 by 2880, which is the optimal resolution for rendering on an iMac. But the game demo that I showed you, that was a 1080p window. So what you want to do is when you're drawing stuff in the game, you want to render it at, say, 1080p. So if I put a pixel at position 1010, that might actually be position 5050 on the actual iMac when it renders it. But because you want a consistent render target that you're working with, and you want basically the graphics drivers to worry about kind of how it all gets scaled. I'll show you the code for that in a bit, but that was the bit that gave me the most headaches. And Stack Overflow may have been used in the production of that piece of code. So another thing I had to build in was sprites and animated sprites. So a sprite is basically an array of pixel data. It's RGB values. So if you use Photoshop or the system I use is called Ace Sprite, which is a really cool little sort of shareware type tool, which lets you draw 2D graphics. It's basically just a long array of RGB values. So what you do is you take those image assets and you put them into that tool that I showed you earlier, the MonoGame pipeline tool, and then that will convert it into something that MonoGame is looking for. Then that lets you render directly onto the screen. So for example, here we've got my duck, one of the ducks on the left, we've got the crosshair, which is another sprite, and then you've got the duck death animation where it falls out the sky, and then a little duck indicator. They're all individual little sprites. But games look a bit boring if you don't do animation. So I had to kind of write an animation system on top of that as well. And it's really quite simple. It just has the animation system. Basically, you load up a list of sprites, then you tell it how you want to play. So in this case, you can play linear or you can do ping pong. So linear, it will go like sprite 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or ping pong, it'll go sprite 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. So you tell it which way you want to play it. You tell it what speed you want it to run at in the game speed. And then you can just tell it to start and stop. So it's really quite simple how it works. And I'll kind of show you those classes in a moment. So another feature, actually no, let's go and have a look at that now actually. Otherwise I'll forget. So in the Exogame 2D library, sort of class library, this is kind of where all the magic happens. So the main class is engine. This is where we set everything up. So we have our world size, things like sprite scaling. So all of the really scary stuff for doing that viewport scaling is kind of in here. So there's some methods that get hooked into the rendering pipeline. Where are they? Yeah, so apply resolution settings. So this is all the stuff here that does all of that kind of behind the scenes scaling of the viewport and calculating the viewport size. I'd like to say that I worked all that out by myself, but I had to kind of do a bit of Googling and try and work out the best way of doing it. Because one of the complaints of MonoGame is that this is actually not really documented on how to do it, but you do kind of need it if you want to do a full screen game. So I worked all that out. So that's engine. And then I've got a folder here called renderers. So we have a sprite based class. So a sprite has a texture. So texture 2D is a MonoGame, an X and A framework object. This is what the textures get loaded to. Each sprite has a location, so where it is on the screen in game coordinates. And then you can have a velocity. So if you add a velocity onto a location, you should start getting the sprite moving on the screen. We have a reference to a content manager, which is kind of basically a class, which is just a big collection of where I load all of the game assets into. Sprite batch is a MonoGame piece of terminology. So you create a sprite batch, you basically do begin sprite batch, you render a load of stuff. Then when you say close sprite batch, it then forces it all onto the screen. So it's kind of a way to do batch rendering. Then we've got things like, rendering the bounding box, stuff like that, and a way of loading the content. So when we load the content, you literally just do content manager.load, tell it that you want to load a texture 2D, and then you give it the name, which was the file name in the asset tool. So it's quite simple to load stuff up. And sitting on top of that, we have a sprite. Now the sprite has various different things like we've got a collides with method. So I'll talk about collision a bit more in a moment, but obviously you want to be able to detect when two things have hit each other, because it'd be a bit of a boring game if things don't hit each other. We've got the actual stuff that does the rendering. But then the interesting one is animated sprites, which kind of builds on that. So we have sprite base. We have a list of texture 2D. So if I've got 3 frames in my animation, so my little duck that was flying was literally just 3 frames of it flapping its arms. They're all loaded into here. You set an animation speed of how fast you want it to go to. Tell it the current frame. So you start at 0. Tell it whether it's a ping pong or not. And then we have an internal timer that runs as well. So you can specify how fast or how slow you want the sprites to run. And then inside, if you want to control that manually, we've got a method here called next frame, which will just cycle through the frames based on whether you're doing linear or ping pong. Or you can have basic play and stop controls on the animation. So when we look at the duck attack code later, where I've got like a class called duck, inside that you're effectively managing a state machine. Games are just state machines and a render loop. It's effectively what they are. So when you've got the duck flying around, that might be in the flying state. And then when I've shot it, it will then go into the death state, which then plays that animation of it falling out of the screen. So all that's just controlled through very simple states and switch statements. There's kind of nothing fancy about it at all. Okay, let's hope that PowerPoint works. Okay, good. So a game is nothing without control. So if you can't actually control the characters on the screen or what you're doing, then it's kind of a bit boring. That quote is by me. Didn't actually get that from anywhere. So with MonoGame, you have support for controllers. So So I know on Windows you can do this, but you can do this on Mac as well. So you can pair a PS4 controller or an Xbox controller, which is great. You can obviously use the mouse, or you can use a keyboard. So the demos I've done is mostly mouse and keyboard. I've not actually written the controller, PS4 controller methods yet, because I haven't really needed it for Duck Attack. Collision detection. So this is an interesting one. So fun comes when objects interact with each other. So in the Duck Attack game, you saw that we could shoot the ducks in a non-lethal way and they fall out the screen and they're totally not harmed. Collision detection can be computationally expensive, so there's different ways in which you can do it. So therefore, we've got a few cheats that we do. So the two that we use are bounding box collision and pixel perfect collision. So bounding box is if you've got a sprite on the screen, if you imagine a tight box around that character and then a tight box around another character. When those two boxes intersect, that's classed as a collision. Now, it's not totally accurate, because if you've got kind of an odd shaped, like a circular sprite, for example, if you imagine drawing a box around it, you've actually got quite a bit of wasted space around there. So you could actually get two objects colliding at the corners where they're not actually colliding, but in terms of the boxes around them, they are colliding. But bounding box collision is very cheap to do. It's a very computationally easy thing to work out. The more expensive one is called pixel perfect collision, where you have two objects that might have, kind of intricate shapes. Then they could get right close to each other, but if none of the pixels are actually touching, then it's not a collision until one of the pixels touches the other object. And that's quite computationally expensive to do. I'll show you the code for doing that in a moment. So if you imagine like we've got Duck Attack here, this is kind of what it looks like with the rendered bounding boxes on it. What I've actually done for the crosshair is, in the actual game, the crosshair is more of that small, the bounding box is that small square in the middle, not the actual full crosshair. Otherwise it'd be a bit inaccurate when you're trying to shoot the ducks. So I've got 3 different game modes: easy, medium and hard. In easy and medium, it's all bounding box collision. So you can kind of think of it like aim assist, because you can be a little bit inaccurate but still hit the duck. When you put it into hard mode, it does pixel perfect collision, which means you have to be completely bang on. So when you're running on some of the later levels and the ducks are going quite fast, they actually become quite hard to hit, which is quite cool. So what you tend to do is you want to kind of have a best of both worlds. So what you might want to do is you might want to start off with a bounding box collision and say, right, have I got an intersection between, in this case here, we've got a pirate lady, I think, and I stole this off the internet. So you've got like a pirate lady and a fire. So you can see here you've got an intersection between 2 bounding boxes. Once you've got that intersection, you can then switch over to pixel perfect collision, because you know those 2 objects are close, and you can then work out whether she has properly intersected with the fire. So that's kind of a cheap way you can do it. So you use bounding box as your catch-all, or like your first state. And when you've got a collision between 2 objects, you can then do pixel perfect if you want to after that. So let me try and find that. So I've got a thing here called a collision manager. And when I talk about how I manage scenes in a moment, it's become a bit more apparent. But when I add objects into a scene, I also put them into a kind of a global static collision manager. It's effectively just a dictionary of sprite names and a reference to their sprites. So at any point in the game, I can just say, is collision duck crosshair? And it will just, instead of it having to walk all the scene graph and do lots of expensive stuff, it just looks in this global registry and says, get me the duck, get me the crosshair. Is there a collision on the bounding box? Bounding box.intersects. If it returns true, great. You can go and do something. So whilst it may seem a bit hacky having this kind of global manager of something, it actually gets a lot of the computation time quite down. So you don't want to be walking a complex scene graph of objects trying to work out who's touched who. It's much easier just to know which objects are likely to touch, pull out a reference from a global dictionary and just check whether they've intersected. The way the pixel perfect stuff works is it first checks whether we have a bounding box intersection. If it does, it then has this method here called collides with. And the way this works, and it is quite complex in how it does, so the larger the sprite, the slower this is going to be, but it effectively has to extract all of the color data and position data for each of the sprites. It then runs through a loop, working out whether any of the pixels from one sprite are actually covering one of the other sprites on the screen. So it's quite slow. So if you have two massive, like, two objects which cover an entire 1080p screen, you want them to kind of touch each other, it can potentially get quite slow if you've got a lot of them going on. So you do need to do a bit of a trade-off about whether you do really need to do pixel perfect collision or whether bounding box is sufficient. And a lot of times bounding box is kind of sufficient for what you want. Okay. Okay, so scene management. So a scene is a bit like a room. If you think of a room and you've got a load of objects in it, so it's kind of like a collection of objects. So you want those objects to move around and interact with each other. So if we take a typical scene, I've got one here called Duck Hunt Scene. Now the way the scene manager works in this engine is you actually have 5 different layers that you can assign sprites to. And what it will do is it will render everything in sprite layer 1 first, then everything in layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, level 5. So you can kind of think of it as kind of like a Z order in which things are being rendered, which is quite useful. So in Duck Hunt or Duck Attack, in layer 1 we have the background. So that's kind of the nice grassy scene in the background. Then we have the ducks in layer 2. In layer 3 we have the scoreboard, the duck counter and the bullet counter. In layer 5 we have the crosshair, the thing you move around with the mouse. And in layer 5 we have the billboard. The billboard is the thing that slides down and says level 1 and then slides back up. So if you think about it in the order that it's rendered, so the background will always be rendered first. So anything that comes after that will be visible on top of the background. So then the next most important thing is the ducks. But if a duck flies underneath the scoreboard or the duck counter, you'd expect the duck counter and the scoreboard to be on top of the ducks, which is why I've done it that way. I thought it looked a bit odd when it's the other way around. So in the engine, when you create a scene, you basically have to assign a render level to each object that goes into it. And so basically that means everything in level 1 will get rendered first, level 2 rendered next. This actually makes it quite cool for doing things like parallax scrolling, which is kind of one of the tasks I've got in this game. So I was going to split the background into different levels and pretend like the farmer's in kind of a car. So you might have the clouds in the background on a lower level, sort of rendering a lot slower. And then you might have sort of 2 or 3 different levels of foreground, which will render at different speeds. And that kind of gives that parallax scrolling feeling. So a good way of doing that, especially if you've got details of trees on some of the layers, is that you might render the sky on the back layer going really slow. Then you might have the next layer, which actually has some tree detail on it, but actually rendering at a different speed. So it should actually let you do some quite interesting parallax scrolling effects. Again, if you're doing like a platform game, you'd have like, maybe the sky rendering in the background and then buildings on the next level and then the platforms on level 3 and then maybe a little Mario style character on level 4, for example. So just make sure that things that are supposed to be in front of another object actually appear in front of that object. The scene manager also has this collision manager that I mentioned just a minute ago as well. So as you add objects into each layer, they also get added into the collision manager for that scene. So that just means that if I'm the crosshair and I want to work out if I've done a collision event with one of the ducks, I don't have to walk through all of these objects in the scenes to work out if I've done that, because that's slow. You don't want to be doing too much stuff in your render loop. So what you do is you just go to the collision manager and say, duck 1, crosshair, have I got a collision? Yes. Okay, let's do something about that. So it's kind of a little trick just to get things rendering a bit faster. And again, levels or layers 1 to 5 render as quickly as you can in the update loop. So if we look, just move the gallery view out of the way. So if we look in here, we have a scene management folder. So in the scene, this is a bit crap. I've kind of done them as, I've only got 5 layers and I've done like a separate list for each layer. I know there's better ways of doing that. I shouldn't be limited to 5 layers. I should be able to have as many as I want, but I was kind of in a rush when I wrote this bit, and I think I was trying to argue with my daughter about maths homework at the time. So I kind of took a few shortcuts. So I do know that. So add sprite to layer, you just give it a layer enum value, and that adds it into the correct list, but it also adds it into the collision manager as well. So we add it into the layers here. You can also remove objects from layers, because if you shoot a duck, you probably want to remove it from the layer because you're not going to render it anymore. So the render scene, literally it goes through, it just iterates through layer 1 first, then it iterates through layer 2, then layer 3 and layer 4, just calling render on each of the objects in there at the time. And then a similar thing for updates. So if you think in terms of the duck, you're trying to render the sprite and calculate the animation frame to play. But in its update loop, you're working out how fast is it going, what direction is it going. If you hit the side of the wall and you want the duck to turn around, obviously you need to flip the horizontal axis of the duck. So things like that will happen in update. Okay, I've already shown you the collision manager, but yeah, so this collision manager lives inside the scene manager. So as you add objects into a scene in a particular layer, they each get added into a sprite dictionary here, and that just makes it easy. If I've got the crosshair and a duck, I want to know whether they've collided. I don't have to search through the scene graph. I just pull the objects out that I know about and then check if there's a collision. So it works quite nicely. Something I forgot to say at the beginning, actually, this is the engine I'm recreating here is something that me and my friend Charlie was building at Argonaut Software. So they had a system at the games company where a very small team could pitch a game idea, and if the management thought it was particularly good, they give you a small budget and about a month to work on a prototype. And then if they think the prototype's any good, you then try and pitch it to a publisher. So we was doing this game called Dino Ball. It was a sort of a dinosaur-based game, but it was basically like Speedball, if anyone remembers Speedball on the Amiga. So it was a top-down game. You got these little like cavemen running around, throwing like a severed head. Well, we actually had a severed head. We changed it to a ball at one point. So it's kind of like a football game, but with dinosaurs. 2D, it was on the PlayStation, the original PlayStation. So it was looking straight down effectively. But then we had 3D objects of like tusks coming out the ground. So as you moved around the 2D field, you actually had these kind of 3D tusks and rocks and boulders actually moving around. So the engine we built on that or what I'm building here is basically that engine that we built for that game, which is quite cool. Sadly, the game didn't get picked up by a publisher, which was a real shame because it was really good fun. You could have like dinosaurs swooping, like a pterodactyl swooping and sort of carry off one of your players and stuff like that. So I didn't just make this up. I'm actually trying to recreate something that I built sort of back in 1998, I think it was. Okay, entity messaging. So each asset in a game that you add to the scene, none of those assets know anything about each other. So a duck doesn't know what a crosshair is. The duck doesn't know what the scoreboard is. Everything is completely isolated and separate. So you can kind of think of it as a bit like microservices running in a container. You've got these, separate computing units that is an asset in a game, but none of them know about each other. And I promise that is as enterprise as I'm going to go in this talk. So never go full enterprise in a games talk. So what the game has, that joke fell completely flat, didn't it? Never mind. So in the game, there's effectively a very simple messaging system built in. And it is very, very simple, but it's very powerful in what it does. Now, if anyone's ever used Unity or Godot or Unreal Engine, this is exactly the same as what you'd see in one of those. If you have a game asset and you want it to talk to another game asset and do something, you send a message to it. Now, the other way of doing it, of course, is you have very tight coupling in your code. And then obviously each object knows what the other objects are and you just, duck, dot, die sort of thing. But obviously, as we all know, as experienced software developers, that's kind of where spaghetti code can start coming into play. So really what you want to do is you want to have these kind of separate game entities that are completely isolated from each other. And the only way you talk to them is through queues. It's kind of very similar to what we do in our day jobs. So there's a system in there called channels, and it is really, really, really simple because I've not built the advanced features yet. And it is basically a dictionary of queues. So the key is a name, and then you have a dictionary in the queue. It's very basic. So, for example, we've got a queue called duck hit, a queue called scoreboard, a queue called gun fired, and a queue called sound effects. So that kind of like the duck hit and a queue, that's classed as a channel. It's a named channel. So you can add channels, remove them. You can check if they exist. You can clear them. You can post messages. You can retrieve messages. It's kind of like very, very baby rabbit MQ in how it works. So, for example, if you have your crosshair and the crosshair knows that it's looking for ducks, and say if you've got a collision with some ducks, you can send a message to the ducks and say, I've hit you. But you can also send a message to the sound effects engine at the same time and say, play a gunshot sound. I've demonstrated the gunshots with a nice M50 50 cal carbine down there, because why not? So that's kind of how the things work. So you send a message to the duck receives that message and goes, oh no, I'm dead. And it then goes into a set, effectively, animation at that point. So you have a state machine that runs, you've got timers triggered off of it. So for the first 1 second, I want to flash the duck and and show the duck sprite. And then I switch to the duck dying state, which is where it shows that inverted duck, and then it falls out the sky, and I send a message to the sound effects player saying play the whistle, which is that kind of whistle sound as it dropped. So that's kind of how you tie things together. So really what we have is, the duck fires, or you fire, you hit a duck, or you don't hit a duck. Another message gets sent to the bullet counter to reduce the amount of bullets that you've got. Another one gets sent to the duck counter at the bottom there to say how many ducks have been either hit or missed. And then you send a message to the scoreboard to say add 10 points when you hit a duck. So none of these objects directly know about each other, but you tie them together by sending very simple events. And it's very, very basic what I've built in there. So what I want to have in there is when you create a channel, I want it to have it automatically create an RTX channel or a return channel, so that you could have that entity kind of send a message back to its original caller. That's something that I think would be quite cool. Didn't actually need it in the Duck Hunt game, which is why I haven't built it yet, but that kind of feels like it would be a good thing to do. And then also things like message ordering and correlation IDs and batching, kind of the things you'd expect in things like ZeroMQ or RabbitMQ. And where that would be useful is if you're doing kind of like a real-time strategy game like Command and Conquer, where you're controlling lots of units. You might send lots of different commands to different units, but you might actually want to batch them up and actually execute them in a certain order at a specific time, as opposed to straight away, which is kind of where correlation IDs and batching could actually be useful. So if we were to look at something in Duck Attack, so if we look in the Crosshair, so these game actors are, none of them really know about each other. So the Crosshair, it loads some sound effects, so the gun sound and the gun click. So the gun click is when you run out of ammo and you just get that kind of click sound. In the update loop here, so for example, when you press the left mouse button to shoot, it posts a message to the gun fired event handler, and it also message, and it also posts a sound effects message which gets picked up by the sound effects system, so it knows when to play the sound effect. In Duck, in its update loop, where are we? Again, it has its own sound effects it loads in, so death, quacks, falling, and flapping. Couldn't really hear the flapping earlier, but it does do it. The update loop, we have a state machine. So all the ducks start in the start state. Basically, they're hidden at the bottom of the screen, so you can't see them. So when the level starts, they're all hidden off screen. Then after a timer triggers, it goes into the flying state. At that point, we can play the quacking and the flapping sound effects. And then we have, in the flying state, we can check a method here called shoot duck. So that this method here is basically looking for a collision with the crosshair. So it's not a complete separation of concerns. The duck knows that there is a crosshair. It just can't actually see or access that object directly. So here what it's doing is it's saying, is there a collision between the crosshair and this object's name? So that object might be duck 1. If there is, return true. At which point, if you get a collision and you've got shots left, you can post a duck hit message. And you can also post a score increment to the scoreboards. The whole thing's just basically held together by events and messages. So if anyone has, say, ever seen or used Unity or things like that, it's kind of a similar concept to that. It's all event-based. But this actually makes it really powerful and really easy to get things going, because you can develop each kind of game actor individually and test them individually. And then it just becomes a case of hooking them up using this event system to actually make things happen. So the billboard that comes down and says, level 1, for example, the way that system works is you just send a message to it and you tell it to play and you tell it what the message is, and it has a preset loop where it scrolls down, waits a few seconds, then scrolls up and disappears. And you can kind of trigger that at any point you want from within the game engine, which is quite nice. Okay, what are we doing for time? Okay, so that's kind of the first version of it. That's kind of where I got to over lockdown. Now, since things have eased up a bit, I've kind of had to spend more time working on actual work stuff. I've got a feeling I may be revisiting some of this stuff soon, as further lockdowns maybe potentially happen. So future game goals. So I've actually got quite a few things I want to build with it. No career, no like commercial aspirations of it at all. It's just purely a piece of fun. So one game I really want to do a version of, like a nice looking version of, is Horace Goes Skiing. I was addicted to this game as a kid on the Spectrum. Absolutely loved it. It's just so cute. You've got a little guy and you scroll down. You have to try and go through the flags, avoid the trees. You get loads of money. You go to the ski shop. You buy better equipment. So I think it'd be kind of nice to sort of do a slightly more modern version of that. There's a game here that wasn't that big in the UK, but it was quite big in the US, called Number Munchers. It's an educational title. It was made by the company that made Oregon Trail, if anyone's played that. And it's an educational game. And the reason I want to do this one is because I think it'll actually be really useful helping my son with maths. As I say, he's got autism and ADHD, so typical teaching methods are not working as well. Whereas if you've got this little character that burps and farts every time you get the correct answer, I think that's kind of a bit more engaging for kids. So I want to do a little remake of that. It's nothing too complex. It should be a fairly simple game to write. I've also got an idea for a little business style simulator, similar style to Oregon Trail, which I want to do. So a big long list of games. And also really fancy revisiting my Dino Ball idea. I think I'm allowed to do it. I don't think Argonaut holds any rights to it anymore because they went bust. But I think that would be quite a fun little arcade game to do. And they're all possible with the game engine. Everything that we've built in there makes it possible to do. So you've got all the components for doing it. Events, sound effects, music, sprites, animated sprites, input handlers, kind of all of the basics that you need are there to basically pretty much write any kind of 2D game that you want. Sort of final thoughts. Not that I've got that many final thoughts, but as I said before, whether you do a game or anything like that, I think actually having a little project that you work on that's completely different to your day job is a really healthy thing to do. Ignoring the idea of like a lockdown, just in general, having kind of, especially if you're having a shit time at work, having kind of a different thing that you can apply your mind to, where you can just kind of think of a spot in the future, visualize what it's going to look like, and then just work out how you're going to get to it. Like work backwards and work out how you're going to build this thing, even if it's small steps at a time. I mean, sometimes I'd spend 5 minutes a day on this. Sometimes I'd get a bit more time and do 2 hours or an hour. It kind of really depended on what was going on that day. But the more you do that, you take small steps each day, you actually end up building something pretty cool. So that's kind of the main thing, is like do coding for fun. I mean, I imagine the majority of us spend a lot of our time doing soulless enterprise applications, which are interesting to certain degrees, but after 15, 20 years, you end up solving exactly the same problems over and over again, but with different frameworks. Kind of gets a bit boring after about 10, 15 years. So actually applying your mind to something completely different is really good. And doing a game engine is a completely different paradigm. Whether you're using Angular, React, Blazor, or whatever, they're all fantastic systems, but they all kind of work in kind of a similar way. It's all very sort of state-based pages being rendered. You're kind of doing the same stuff, but with just different engines. Whereas this is a complete paradigm shift. It's like you have a very tight render loop and you have to try and get everything done so that you can maintain 60 frames a second. It kind of makes you think in a different way. Simple things like if you've got a directed graph of objects and you want those objects to talk to each other, the algorithmically proper way is to walk the graph and kind of, walk backwards, go back to the grandparents and then walk down the siblings and stuff. Great, but rubbish for a game because that's very expensive to do that. So it kind of makes you think of like different cheaty, hacky ways of getting around what should be a fairly simple problem. So that's kind of the main message from it, code for fun. So that's it. how long did that last, along with all my fumblings with PowerPoint? About an hour. You can mostly find me on plural sites. I do a whole range of stuff on there. So this is at this point, I normally say hands up if you're a plural site subscriber, but I can literally only see 4 people on the screen, so I'm not going to ask that. But you can find me on there. I've been working with them for about 6.5 years now. I do a range of courses from got quite a few .NET based ones through to sort of soft skills, leadership and management style stuff, because I find workplace psychology quite interesting. So I've done quite a few courses around that area. I don't know if anyone uses Skillshare. Skillshare is where I put the stuff that Pluralsight doesn't want, but I want to build it anyway, so I just upload it onto Skillshare. So I've got quite a few interesting courses on there. But with that, thank you very much. I apologise for the fumbling with technology earlier. I kind of got a bit thrown for a loop there because my presenter view didn't show up on my iPad, which is kind of fun, but never mind. We got there in the end. So I don't know what happens now, whether Pete or Jessica takes over.
Yeah,
any questions?
Go on, Jess. Go on.
It was a really fantastic talk. Thank you so much for that, Stephen. For those who don't know as well, Stephen also runs a few podcasts, which are well worth listening to. Unfortunately, I'm on 2 of his episodes of Side Hustle. So you'd have to listen to my squeaky voice for a little while if you want to listen to that one. Stephen,
they're actually very good episodes, actually. I was about to say, I interviewed Jessica, and yeah, it was just Jessica on the first one. I interviewed her while she was organising DDD East Midlands.
Which I'm wearing a hoodie for.
And then we did one in January at NDC London, which was kind of the post-mortem, like kind of, how did it go? And I interviewed Jessica and Morton on that one. And they're 2 really interesting episodes. If you want to see what goes into organising a conference.
I think we got carried away in the second one. We talked a bit too much, but it was good fun. Would you like us to open up the floor to questions and unmute everybody?
There, we can have a go.
Cool. Let's give it a go, see what happens. There we go.
You have to unmute yourselves. All we can do is ask you to do that. But yeah, so do unmute yourself and ask. Mordy, who's now left, I think, wanted to know if you're taking requests on games to make.
Sure, why not? As long as it's 2D. I cannot be bothered with 3D.
Yeah, I want Dizzy doing.
I spent years doing 3D. Really hard.
I want Dizzy doing, please.
I'll tell you what though, I mean, if you are thinking of tinkering with stuff, I mean, you don't necessarily have to build like a whole engine yourself. Where's the slide? I mean, there are some really fantastic free systems out there. So Unreal Engine, you can actually use Unreal Engine for free if C++ is your thing. Unity is good, but it is a bit cumbersome. It is a bit of a beast. Well, it's turned into a beast just by the virtue of its age. These 2 down here, so I was saying about Defold, which is worth looking at. That's the one that King used for doing things like Candy Crush and Soda Crush or whatever they're called. Don't discount it just because it's those games. They built a fantastic engine and they were really good enough to actually open source it and pay for the maintainers. So they actually pay people just to work on it full time. And there's another one called Godot or Godot. So people seem to argue about what it's called, including the creators. But that's if you want to build cross-platform games, either 2D or 3D over mobile, but you don't want to have to worry about writing a rendering engine and all that sort of stuff yourself, then that's a really good platform to use. And it's completely free. It's open source. And there's lots of books and courses, not on Pluralsight, I might add, but there are courses all over the internet and lots of YouTube videos which show you how to do it. So if you just want to actually build things and you've got some art assets and you just want to link them together using messaging, like we talked about earlier, you can just use those systems. It's good fun. So it forces you to think in a different way. And you don't have to create anything commercial if you don't want to. I mean, that little duck attack game I done's pants, but it was good fun.
Yeah, well, you're going to learn concepts, aren't you? How it works. Scratch is about as far as I've gone for making games. I made a little Dizzy. I'll put the link in the chat in there because I grew up playing that sort of game. So similar to you with Horace Goes Skiing and Horace and the Spiders and all of those things is where we grew up, I guess, with age, aren't we?
As soon as you hit 40, you start reminiscing about the things from when you was a kid.
Yeah, I've still got them. It's all good. Carl's asked a question in the chat. Based on your last comments, would you say that Unreal is an easier engine to pick up for a new user?
Probably not, because it's huge. It's massive, and you have to use C++ as well. So when I showed
You can
What's that?
code in C# in Unreal.
Oh, can you now? Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't know
and
that.
there are courses for beginners as well.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, sure. Why not? Does Unreal do 2D as well? Or is that mostly 3D?
Yeah, you can do 2D and 3D, but their C# courses and documentation is pretty strong.
Oh, okay. Fair
Yeah.
enough. It's moved along a lot since I last used it. Unreal's a bit of an interesting one at the minute because they're having their weird spats with Apple at the moment, which is all getting a bit messy. So I know a lot of Unreal developers were getting a bit worried because Apple were threatening to cancel all of Epic's developer accounts, but the court stepped in and said no, you can only suspend Fortnite.
It was a little bit rude what they did, I think. Kind of circumvent.
To be fair though, I mean, I know Epic's got. I don't want to get into a Apple war, but I know. I'll say my stance on it, and then you can all shout at me if you disagree. But so Apple's App Store policies where they charge 30% and the monopolistic stuff, completely agree with that. That has to change. But from my stance, Epic had signed a developer agreement. And Americans love their contracts. They love to sue each other over everything. They sign a developer agreement and then they've completely blown it to pieces. In that respect, they kind of deserve everything they get because that's the way the legal system works. That's why you sign contracts. So if they're trying to prove some big point and go up against Apple, I think they're mad. But there you go. But a lot of Unreal developers were getting a bit worried at the minute because the developer certificates were on the cusp of being rescinded for Unreal as well. But I don't think that's actually happening at the moment. But yeah, I mean, if you can do C# in Unreal, that's great. Last time I looked at it.
I only know because I've been doing it the last couple of weeks.
Oh, cool.
What have you been doing, Jess?
Have you built anything with it?
Nothing much yet. I've been trying to make a little 2D platformer in my spare time, just for a bit of fun.
Oh, cool.
Tony's
Look forward to the talk.
Have you tried using Phaser at all?
Phaser.
Phaser.io, isn't it?
Yeah, JavaScript engine.
JavaScript. No, I haven't.
Okay, well that's totally free. You can
is
put
it a 2D?
Yeah.
What's a 2D thing in JavaScript?
Yeah, just Google Phaser.io and you'll be there.
Okay.
There was a Tech Nottingham talk on that, workshop-y type talk on that. One of the first Tech Nottinghams I went to, actually.
Right.
It was quite good. That was. That must have been a while back now.
There's a really good hack at Hack24 as well that I lost a lot of time on, where someone had made a game using Phaser, which was you had to avoid people in the corridor and stay a certain amount of distance away from them.
Phaser.io, is it?
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yep.
Yeah, it was like a COVID game before COVID happened. It was great.
Yeah, so I've written a game. I'm writing a game using that at the moment. But I'm looking at Godot after that, and it's to teach maths for children as well. So, and that's in my spare time.
Amazing.
Cool. That looks pretty good. I mean, Godot looks really, really, really good. I mean, I was going to use that first. I mean, the reason I stuck with MonoGame and C# is just purely because I'm a Microsoft MVP. So if you show Microsoft these things, they let you keep the award, hopefully. Plus, I love C# anyway, but Godot or Godot, whatever it's called, I mean, that's a brilliant system. That is.
Yeah. There's
lots of.
There's also a lot of support for tiled as well in a lot of these sort of game engines. I don't know if you looked into that for creating your environments at all in future. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, not in this particular engine. I mean, I've done obviously a lot of that stuff before. I mean, the thing I did on actually, let's see if I can find a video of it. Just bore you all with a video. I had it earlier. Croc. GC. Yeah. This is the Game Boy game that I did. First projects I released. See the video, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So on that, I did a lot of the level design, but I also wrote all the tools for it. So we wrote a system where the artist would create all of the tiles in fairly limited palettes as 30 by 32 pixel tiles. Load it into the editor, and then designers would build the levels. But then what it'll do is it had to get those first two tiles, split them into 8 by 8 tiles, and then it had to work out if there's any duplicates across a tile map because the Game Boy really has no memory on it. So you had to do that and optimize all the palettes. And then that'll give you a warning to tell you whether the artist had gone over their color count or not, which really pleased them when he told them that. But then it had to convert all of the tile maps to palettes, and then all of the map data into assembly language. Well, not even assembly language, it's hex codes. It's just pages and pages of hex, which then gets loaded into the engine, which is quite cool. I really like this game. It's kind of it has its fans. You still get people talking about it on the internet, which is nice. In fact, has it got bits on? This is like a complete workthrough. Some of the artwork was really good. So when I said about that game that I made when I was 16 with my friend Chris, so when I got the job at Argonauts, because Chris was basically my best friend when I was younger, or still is, and so I got him a job at Argonaut, managed to get him in. So he did the artwork for Croc. So we went from like as being 16-year-olds building this kind of like aliens-inspired game on the Amiga to actually working together at Argonaut, which is quite cool. And he still works in the games industry. He works for what they're called, Ninja Theory.
Okay.
He worked on that. My brain's gone blank now. They did a PL game that was kind of all about mental health. Can't remember the name of the game, but he was one of the lead animators on that. So he still works in the industry. He's got the credits in. The end screen, because you had literally no memory when you got to the end of the game. There was you're like haggling for bits and bytes on the cartridge at that point. Oh yeah, that's me. Hey, testing. Map builders, me. Yay. And tools programming, me. Yeah, cool. Sorry, boring you.
That's really cool. When was that? How old was that game?
That would have been about 98, 99, I think.
Oh, okay, cool.
Very glad to see there's a lot of
originally
Stardew Valley fans.
What's that?
I was very glad to see there's a lot of Stardew Valley fans during your talk.
Oh yeah, Stardew Valley. That's brilliant. And all written in MonoGame.
Amazing game.
Which is great. Any other questions? It's all run. The thing I showed all runs on Windows as well, because when I created the project, I picked OpenGL as the renderer because it was easy. One thing to mention on that is if people are Mac users, when I mention OpenGL, they go, "Oh, hasn't Apple basically deleted OpenGL and got rid of it in favor of their Metal rendering engine?" Which technically they have, but what Apple's turned around and said is they're not getting rid of the existing OpenGL version under Mac OS. They're just not moving to the newer versions and going to Vulkan. So the older versions, which are perfectly fine for what we're doing here, is still staying. They're not getting rid of it. They're just not progressing to newer versions of OpenGL because they want people to use Metal, which is kind of their version of DirectX. So from looking on the forums for MonoGame, there is kind of talk about them actually producing Metal renderers for it. Because MonoGame will let you do 3D, it's just you have to do a lot more of the work yourself. So if you want texturing, mip mapping, decent lighting, specular highlighting, that sort of stuff, you have to kind of do a lot of that yourself. And there is actually a flight simulator that was written in MonoGame.
While he's searching for that, I have a question for Pete.
There you go, there's the flight sim there.
Do we know about JetBrains winners?
No, I've not even looked. We can do that. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. Latest. A few people have tweeted. So let's have a look. Just make sure I'm not going to miss anybody. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to do this really scientifically. And Stephen, pick a number between 1 and 4.
3.
3. And that will be Speedy Narc on, so Joro550 on Twitter. Who is that? Oh, is he still there? Or she's still there, in fact. I don't know.
Oh, yes, I know who that is. They're not online at the moment.
That's okay. I can send them a message.
Oh, well, congratulations. Yay.
Yeah. Well done to Speedy Narc and Joro 550.
Oh, he is online. Sorry. He's in the chat.
Oh, okay. Well, how do you know that? Oh, is that a private message then?
No, it's on to everyone. Just hello.
Sinners, Mark.
Oh, okay. Right. I was mistiming my looking there. Well done. If you drop us a follow on either me personally or .NET Knots, if you don't already do that, then I'll send you a key and some details on how to join, rather claim. Well done.
Well, thank you very much for everything, Stephen. It's been really good. Thank you to Pete for doing the JetBrains thing, because I keep forgetting to do it every month.
No, you reminded me. Yeah, thank you.
And if anyone wants to hang around, have a drink, chat, the Zoom will stay open until the last person leaves, pretty much, which will be Pete normally.
Some hardcore. And Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to. I mean, if you got to go, are you hanging around or what?
I can hang around for about 10 minutes or so.
I don't know if you wanted to do like a file new Hello World on what it was, just to show us, because obviously we've seen code and everything, but I don't know how easy that would be for you to kind of file new Hello World and drag a couple of things on the screen.
I don't know. Today's the first time I've looked at this code in about 6 weeks. So. I mean, the best thing to do is go to the GitHub repo and then look at the tutorials that are in there. Hold on.
Is it okay if I post a blog about this talk as well, Stephen, on our blog site?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome sauce.
Might just share my screen again. So on my GitHub repo, so github.com/StephenHaunts, there's Exogame 2D in there, so you can basically just clone or download the code from there. All loads as one solution. But then there's some tutorials in here. I've basically got about 16 tutorials planned. I've just not actually finished writing them all yet. Which kind of take you through each of the different things that you can do. But the draw sprite one, does what it says on the tin. It just lets you load up a sprite, which is a logo, and it just lets you draw it onto the screen. You say graphics device.clear, tell it what color to clear it to. You say begin render scene, because the sprite gets added into the scene in layer 1, and then you just say end render, and then it switches it onto the screen. That's probably the simplest one.
Happy days.
If you didn't want to use my engine, you wanted to make your own thing, then there's loads of tutorials and documentation on monogame.net. But because they kept all of the same interfaces and API from XNA, if you find loads of XNA tutorials from like 15 years ago, they all still work because they kept it exactly the same as XNA, which is quite cool.
Okay, I think I had a play with XNA way back in the dim and distant past.
It's good because when they started Xbox Live Arcade back on the Xbox 360, you had to use XNA and C# to build the games on it.
Yeah, that's quite cool.
I think games like I think Fez was written in MonoGame and C#. If anyone's ever played Fez,
Don't think so.
It's the game that starts 2D and then it opens up and becomes all weird 3D.
yeah, it's a bit of a trippy
Polygon,
game.
isn't it? That's the studio.
Yeah, so there's loads of little starter guides on there, which will help you out. There seems to be a pretty good community around it as well. But say if you enjoy C# and you want to have a bit more control over what you're doing, then it's quite a good little framework to use.
I like it. How easy is it? What sort of skills transfer between that and if you wanted to make the jump to 3D games in a different platform or framework? Or
I mean, you can do 3D with MonoGame. I just chose not to.
Okay.
So I'm not quite sure how the asset pipeline works, but I mean, if you're using something like Blender, you can get 3D models out of it, turn them into assets for MonoGame, and then render them onto the screen.
Right.
But whereas, if you're trying to do something more modern where people expect really fancy lighting and shadows and stuff like that, you're not going to get any of that in MonoGame. You have to do that yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When I was at Criterion, I wrote a shadow renderer, and it's really hard. Don't do it. Don't want to do it again.
It's all RTX and ray tracing now, though, isn't it? Imagine that.
Yeah, so MonoGame does have full shader support, especially if you're doing stuff on Windows as well, and you want to do stuff that works on NVIDIA properly.
The thing...
NVIDIA's a dirty word on the Mac.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, the thing about 3D games is that 3D maths is really difficult.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, MonoGame does give you a pretty good maths library. So if you're trying to cast a ray from one point to another and see if it intersects with an object, it has all those maths libraries built in, as well as all the matrix translation, multiplication, and scaling, and all that sort of stuff. All that stuff is built into MonoGame. So you can do it. But if you want an easier ride of it to build a 3D game, you probably want to use something like Unreal Engine or Unity or...
Yeah.
Some games have made a lot of money from having really bad physics, right? Like Gang Beasts and Octodads.
Yeah.
I play too many games.
They've tried too hard with the physics, like Goat Simulator.
Sorry if I missed this while you were giving your talk, Stephen. How do you work with maps and showing a great big long map? How does it? Is there like a viewport and you can move it across, or?
I mean, there is a viewport. So if you render any pixels outside the viewport, it won't get rendered. But if you're doing a lot of processing on a larger map in your update method, that won't get stopped. So you do need to keep track of that yourself.
Right.
So if you're just rendering, say, 32 by 32 or 64 by 64 tiles, for example, I mean, you know how big your map is, and you know roughly where your map is on the screen. So you might have kind of a 2-tile kind of border around what's viewable, so that you can actually sort of tell when things go out of view. But you'd have to keep track of that yourself.
Right. Okay. I like it. You never tempted to go back and do games programming as a line of work, or are you just happy doing your problem stuff? And
I wouldn't get back into that industry. It's moved on far too fast from when I was in there. The thing is, I really enjoyed the work. Did not like the industry. I don't know what it's like now, but there was some really shady crap going on when I was there. Like when I worked at Tomb Raider, Core Design, because obviously a lot of people who worked on Tomb Raider got massive bonuses. So there's this really big like culture of big bonuses at that place. And I overheard, when you have your headphones on, you're not actually listening to anything, but they think you're not listening. You overhear conversations about people trying to work out how to screw each other over on bonuses. It was so toxic. I mean, people go on about toxic work cultures now. It's like you have not seen anything like what the games industry was like in the early 2000s. Because these companies were run by people that used to be testers or producers who've basically thought, oh, let's run a company, and they've managed to get a bunch of money to build a game, but they have no idea how to run a company. So some of these places back then were horrific to work at. I'm sure it's much better now, but back then, I mean, you talk about toxic work cultures, and some of the things I witnessed back in them days were, yeah. I won't say about some of the stuff that happened at Argonaut. Like the guy who runs it, Jez San, his dad was proper dodgy. He used to supply all sorts of interesting things to the development teams to keep them working through the night, allegedly. It was, yeah, there was all sorts of weird things that went on then.
You're live on YouTube, don't forget, Stephen.
There was a games company recently
that bit.
that it was published they were providing therapy to their games devs after the release of a certain game because of the hours they were working. So they paid for counselling afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, back in
It's
the, I mean
insane.
that stuff was all part and parcel of working in the games industry. So when I was, in your early 20s, you didn't think anything of working 3 or 4 days in the office and taking naps under your desk. That was kind of, it seems stupid thinking about it now, but that was kind of what you expected, and everyone kind of enjoyed it. And there was a kind of level of camaraderie between the team when you had to do things like that. I couldn't even imagine doing anything like that now. 11 o'clock at night, past that, I'm useless. So I couldn't do that now. But I think the games industry now is very different to what it was back then.
I'm trying to think of the games team. There's a really well-known team who don't shave throughout the entire development of a game. And they have like before and after pictures of their giant beards.
Oh, that was Hello Games, the guys who did
Yes.
No Man's Sky.
Okay.
I loved that. It was so good.
Imagine those beards got quite long.
They did.
Depends if they only got 3 months to make the game.
Yeah, so I mean, I imagine the games industry is a completely different world now. Would I be able to go back into it? Nah, I don't think so.
Working in an office again for somebody else, Stephen. We've had this discussion before, haven't we?
Oh yeah. Plus, I just couldn't work for anyone else. No, I'd be a horrific employee. I'm too used to doing things my own way.
Yeah. Oh, that was cool. Has anybody else got any more questions?
What time next month? What's the date next month? Pete?
Oh, Monday, the 26th of October.
Cool.
From 6:30. We've got Martin Beebe and Luce Carter, so 2 fab speakers for that event. That's going to be good. What is it? Then November's is pretty cool. I'm not going to announce that just yet, but you can take a hint. if you are a .NET dev, then you know what's happening in November, so you can take your lead off of who you think we've got for our November meetup. And it's not Scott Hanselman. So. So that should be good.
Cool. I guess that's that then. Should we wrap up for the evening?
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, cool. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much. Congrats again to was it Jojo 550 or can't quite remember your Twitter handle, but I'm winning the JetBrains license, and thanks to them for the free license there too. Thanks very much to Stephen for coming along and giving up his time to give the talk. Thanks to Jess for raising all of those issues and doing the Hacktoberfest stuff. Do please get involved with that. Not only is it good for Hacktoberfest, but we also get a website out of it. So we like that.
If anyone can add issues as well, please do. I'm running out of inspiration.
Yeah, anything you like. Maybe we need to have a little 2D game built into that, hey, Stephen?
Maybe.
See you all again next month. Look out for when I announce the thing on Meetup and sign up for that. So yeah, thanks very much. Oh, hold on, right? What's it over there? What was the GitHub? Carl's asking, what's the GitHub for the website?
I will throw that into the chat now,
yep.
and we'll tweet it as well and put it into Meetup.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming.
There you go. I just posted it to
chat. Cheers.
Awesome.
I express no warranty over the code. there's some humdingers in there which I need to get rid of.
Yeah, like you say, it's not enterprise level stuff, is it?
No. Just a bit of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay.
Cool. Well, thanks for everyone coming along.
Yeah, see you all again soon.
Have a
See
good
you
evening.
later.
Cheers.